All right, so we'll get started. Lou and I are going to try to take a crack at getting maybe half, I don't know, we'll see how long this goes, of this strategy type thing. Overview of the goal of what we want to do this. We want to just provide a basic understanding to the elements, to the strategy of the league. Like, this is a different league. I think a lot of people are just understanding those things as they read the bylaws. There's just a lot of different nuances that you don't necessarily consider when you're playing just a normal dynasty league, or when you even switch from a one QB league to a two QB league. Like, those shifts aren't nearly as drastic as what this kind of entails. We want to provide some examples of situations in order to broaden those applications, like when you would use some of these strategic elements, those types of things. And then just have this video be a future resource that people can come back to over time when they maybe don't remember what the value of those things are, and come back to them. Just want to make sure that people note at the very beginning, this is a new league. These strategies could shift down the road. People play this differently. People adjust to how people play it. That means things kind of adjust. These are just way me and Lou are going to convey this as our past experiences in this format, and how we think they will project onto what we've done here. And hopefully have a good understanding of it. I think we have a good understanding of how this format works and what you want to do. And we've over the fall, him and I spent a lot of time just talking back and forth on what these different elements that we wanted to try do in a league like this. So this doesn't mean that what we say is going to be gospel by any means, because this stuff could shift. We could have new rules down the road that stuff didn't work, whatever. And then each situation might be applied differently for each team. There's 100 teams. There is not going to be the same team build from each out of any of those 100 teams. Like, every team is going to have a different set of players, meaning they could have a different set of strategies with this. So those are things just to consider as we move forward. Wanted to touch base first and foremost with roster composition. That's the backbone of the entire league, how your team is made up. As a reminder, this is a league that focuses on NFL players that are primarily in their first year to their fourth year, and trying to mirror that into a college football landscape. Seems kind of convoluted, but once you kind of think about this format, it all just kind of makes sense. So when it comes to these things, there's 3 different position groups in our league. There's QBs, running backs, and then we've grouped wide receivers and tight ends together. Lou, jump in whenever you want to when it comes to these things, but I know in this format, the primary bell of the ball are quarterbacks. It's a position that is incredibly scarce to have players that produce at a certain level. And the quarterbacks are even rarer just because of the sheer lack of number. And that's partially why we do the multiple copies, so there's enough that we can at least have fun with the format. But ultimately, QBs are the first stop, and they're usually the ones that are the most valuable and the most sought after, and what you absolutely need to compete in a league like this. I'm sure you would agree with all those statements.
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, too, like I think there's just different strategies about it. Like, don't get me wrong, you absolutely need a quarterback, but I don't think you need to go and drop. It's different because I want to talk off of like the $100 schedule, but we've got 400 here, so it's hard for me to kind of go, okay, here's where I expect top quarterbacks to be. But I'm not going to be going and putting a large sum of money on somebody like Lamar Jackson or I don't know who was good, Joe Burrow or something like that. My brain's fried. So like, you can 100% do that, but like I'm not in that grouping. But then there are also going to be people that are going to be like, there's no way I'm not paying for a quarterback. And then that second tier of guys, which is, like your Sam Donalds and your whoever else in that group, like you also may realize like halfway through this thing, like I don't really want to pay anything for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can definitely get by with punting the quarterback, but at some point, like for you to win seriously, you're gonna have to get a quarterback. I mean, we saw that, in some other leagues where teams didn't have a quarterback and then they had to go all in on one, and then once they have it, that's kind of like their missing piece. But at the same time, you lose out on an entire recruiting period, because you had to spend all your money on what you identified as the top quarterback.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think from my sentiment that because of how many teams there are, like a Sam Darnold, you would have to have comparable pieces that would put you, like, you'd have to have so many, we'll go back a year. You'd have to have like Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, and like just a stable of running backs and other players at other positions that could lift you enough where we saw a lot of copies of Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray's usually being the team, Josh Allen's last year, that usually were the teams that were at the height of those national rankings, because that position, they usually had other pieces on the team, but that QB position elevated them. Like that gap between a Sam Darnold and a Patrick Mahomes in this format is like a canyon versus maybe just like a small hurdle. So that's kind of stuff that's exasperated in this format due to youth, like the disparity between a really good quarterback and like a ho-hum quarterback. There's not other alternatives to fill that vacancy. Like it's a sizable gap. And the same thing happens with wide receivers and other positions. It's just that there's more of them that kind of fill those things up, where quarterback is definitely one that's more scarce. So with that said, quarterbacks are usually the top price getters for understandable reasons. Running backs and wide receivers have their own markets. They tend to have the same type of disparity where the top ones go for a lot of money. Running backs, in this way we score this, will probably see their top guys go for more, but the curve on what you paying for them probably comes down a lot faster in this format versus what wide receivers and tight ends, just because of the abundance of them. So just to give some context as to our scoring format, we have a half PPR, half point per first down. And we kind of did this based on these scoring comparisons of different things. And this is just kind of the bell curve of what the position groups for all players that played in the NFL last year. So it's not just our 1 through 4 group, but just these curves that you can see that the point totals for quarterbacks tends to be elevated, and the running backs kind of goes upwards a bit steeper than wide receivers, but wide receivers just have a considerably longer tail. So a lot of more depth and people that will play that can fill in. And that's why they tend to have, that's why we also have them have more starting positions to kind of utilize some of those depth pieces. So those are just kind of the disparity in positions that we might see. This is not an end-all be-all type thing, and the way the NFL works and changes over the years could definitely change the way that we value these players. But this is just what we've seen and are expecting from the last few years of data.
Yeah, and if this wide receiver tight end stuff was split, the tight end numbers are going to be terrible too. So it's one of those things. I probably jumped the gun because I think we're on point whatever, and I think tight ends is the next one. But it's one of the things I'm excited for. Like Kyle Pitts is like way up here, and I'm waiting. I'm like, somebody please spend a whole lot of money on him, because very, very rarely does the tight end actually work out in this format. If you look back at all the tight ends that are drafted super early, most of them, if not all of the early ones, take a few years, like the Eric Ebrons, those guys. I'm not saying that they're elite, but by the time that they're ready to produce, they're going to be out of this window or pretty damn near close to it. And so the tight end aspect, I love it. I don't touch tight ends, but I love watching everybody else spend money on tight ends. And so I kind of like the drop off. You can see this 2019 shows it a little bit better, I think, than the 2018. Just because there's a lot of running backs on that top little tier there. But for the most part, you can see the drop off in the quarterback, which Brian and I kind of were talking about a little bit here, how the scoring kind of drops off, and that gets even extrapolated more when you realize that this is every quarterback and not, just the ones that are 1 through 4. And obviously the same thing happens with the running backs, but yeah, it's interesting. The wide receivers are definitely, there's more of those to use. And I think it's something that we've talked about, not only in this format, but in a different format that we play in. the wide receivers, the low end guys that aren't going to catch a whole lot of passes, but might be doing things like returning punts or returning kicks, are going to get extra points. And so that's valuable, especially in this format and the increased roster size here. So with having 30 roster spots, it's definitely worth looking into guys that have potential to return kicks and punts and things like that for the added points.
Absolutely. I totally agree that there's some added value. And the tight ends, the reason why we have them grouped together is what Lou said, was because we found that they don't frequently put up enough points that they're going to get used or started. So we just group them in, and players like Kyle Pitts might come along and they will hopefully get priced to the point that they should, but oftentimes they don't. But they will be valuable in their own capacity. Like there's a point where a TJ Hawkinson is more valuable than another wide receiver because he'll put up more points than like the fourth or third wide receiver for your roster. So there's value where it is, just not exclusively split out for it, just because that position is really tough to gauge, is what we found. And who wants to spend time worrying about tight ends anyway? So, this bottom table is kind of built on what I've thought the positions kind of look like, and this is including having 2 copies per conference. So I based everything off this middle starter column where there are 16 teams in a Power 5 conference. There's 20 in minor, but there's 16 teams. So 16 quarterbacks are going to be started every week. Running backs, I've estimated there'd be probably about 2.5 that will be started, because you have to start 8 players. And then there's about 4.5 wide receivers and tight ends that'll be started per team. So there's about 16, 40, and 72 players, and those can be multiple copies. And we expect that using some of these tier things that I've used to just kind of give some general pricing for the league. Per team, I'd expect like 3 to 4 quarterbacks on a roster, 7 to 8 running backs, and 13, 14 wide receivers. And that only even tallied up comes to about 25 players, 24, 25 players. So there's still even room after that to add more players, balance those numbers however you want. Because I know not every team in this format is going to carry 30 deep. I just don't expect people to do that.
It never works that way.
No
one ever does.
No. So I don't expect it to happen. That's why it's a little more lean. But this is kind of something I'm hypothesizing is what each roster is going to be roughly constructed as. So something to consider if you're looking at building your auction board and who you want to target and how many of those players you want to target, because this maybe is helpful. The other thing to balance is really eligibility, and it's more important for the startup than I think probably years going down, because you have more control on who you pick up in the startup auction this year than in future seasons, because most of that's freshmen that's coming in, and you're supplementing your roster. So I don't know about you, Lou, but I most of the time think that there's usually about a fourth of your roster that overturns year over year. And that kind of makes expected sense, because you're having seniors graduating and you're bringing in freshmen each and every year. So each year you're losing about a fourth of your roster. That's usually the trend I've noticed when I played in this format. I'm usually pitching and cutting people, and I'm reducing my roster by a fourth. Now with us having larger rosters, I don't know if that's going to hold true. But that's what I'm kind of thinking as much.
Once you're established, I would say like that's probably an underestimate. I would think, at least for the first couple of years here.
True.
Just because there's, and again, it's not going to apply to everybody, but I think there are going to be a large number of teams that are going to have quite a bit of turnover in the first year or two, simply because if you spend money on somebody like Lamar Jackson and I'm trying to think who's still eligible, like a Joe Mixon, Lamar Jackson. Once you're on that train where you're like almost borderline all in on year one, then to you it makes sense to start collecting them 1 and 2 year players. Whereas somebody that's kind of going for a more spread out feel or thinking long term, you just tend to collect more of those players. And so I think we'll have a bunch of teams that are going to struggle with that. But then it also works kind of to like, once you're set up and established too, like if you hit on a lot of your guys that would have been easy cuts are now no longer easy cuts. And so you run into like, okay, what do I do? Like I have the same, I mean, I have zero. I have lost nobody in NCFF, which is similar format, a little bit different roster lineups and all that other stuff, but the same process where players are graduating and you only have that 1 to 4 year window that you can use the red shirts and all this other stuff. I lose nobody, so I've got to go through and now decide, okay, what is that right percentage of roster turnover? Like how many guys do I want to drop in order to add players? So I think after you're set up, if everything kind of goes as planned, you probably do get a little bit of a rollover that you can project and predict. But things can always, I mean, that's what's great about it. Things can always change. You can do really, really bad and then have, where you're dropping, all your guys hit, where you're dropping like your N'Keal Harry's and your Tua Tagovailoa, whatever his last name is, and all those guys that Brian likes that don't score points, and you got to drop them after a few years. But
N'Keal Harry, I'll definitely agree on. But to your point, I think one thing I was going to allude to, and it kind of jumps into this redshirt piece below, is the elongation of the player pool as the years progress. So as we play more years, the number of red shirts that have been applied start accumulating. And you have more players that you're playing with and keeping on your roster because you're essentially kicking the can down the road for another year to be able to play them longer. So you'll have more redshirt seniors, redshirt juniors, blah, blah, blah on your roster, and they're sitting on your roster longer, meaning you're keeping them around longer, which probably for the first few seasons is a bit more turnover because you're not going to be able to keep Lamar Jackson as a senior. Whereas, Trevor Lawrence, you might redshirt this year and you'll carry him into his 5th season and he's on your roster as is. So with that in mind, I will say, please be careful with eligibility just from the standpoint that people do graduate. People are going to declare early, and we'll talk about that maybe next episode, but people do graduate early. So there is some unpredictability. And if you are too senior upperclassman heavy, you could eventually be the worst team in your conference pretty quickly from graduates and early declares. So something to be mindful of. It's going to be a lot harder to make those mistakes in future seasons as it is in the startup. I think it's really easy to just, grab a bunch of seniors, be really good this year, and then next year the bottom falls out. So just something to be mindful of.
Right. But I would say, and I'll be real quick, just I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Like that happens. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of teams that go for that. Just realize, I mean, again, this setup, like the 30-man roster, I mean, I love it. I'm sure Brian loves it, which is why we ultimately, that's what we fixed in on. Use it. I mean, stock up and there's nothing wrong with taking like, we still have the period where you can add guys for like $0 or $1 or whatever it is. Fill out your roster. I mean, there are times where you can add guys like a Jacoby Brissett and I'm trying to think of who else, Kyle Allen's, and just guys that on paper really have no value, but over the course of a few years, if something happens, they get a chance to get an opportunity, something happens, then now you're in a spot where if the bottom does fall out, at least you've got some pieces you can play with and finagle some things around with. And I think that 30-man roster limit is really going to help with that. You should be able to get a more rounded roster here, whereas in the other leagues where we play with this format, you really don't have the ability to roster, more than 1 or 2 quarterbacks, because you'd rather have it, you'd rather have that investment in a wide receivers or running backs. And at least here you have some flexibility. Maybe that's where the tight ends play a role in this league or something, just something to kind of round out your roster, just to keep an eye on it. But then with what Brian says, yes, you can, once redshirts get applied and everything else, you have that longevity. For example, Christian McCaffrey's been in the league 4 years, so he won't be eligible here. But in NCFF, I still have him for 2 more years because of how I've used red shirts. But that can also, in this format, be taken away from you so quickly with an early, declaration or something like that. So honestly, it's a slippery slope that don't always count on. Hey, I'm gonna potentially have a red shirt that first season and then have a medical, and I'm gonna have him for 4 more years beyond that, because it's not. More often than not, it's not going to play out like that where you're going to get it, but there are going to be instances where it does happen. So I wouldn't plan for that kind of stuff, where in other leagues we definitely have the ability to plan for, hey, redshirt that initial year, hold on to them for 4 more and be set with that. Here it's like almost give and take. There's that, oh yeah, you might have it, but then it can just be ripped out from you that quickly. So I'd keep an eye on that aspect of the league.
Yeah, and that brings up the great point, like what I have under how do you approach traditional red shirts, is it's essentially a gamble. You're gambling, am I going to, you get 4 years of production from a player. That's all you're going to get out of a player. I'm hedging year 1 versus year 5 when you're going to redshirt someone. So they have to sit on your taxi as a freshman for an entire season. They can't be played. They have to be on taxi. And you essentially are making a conscious decision at that point that I'm making the bet that he's going to be a better NFL player year 5 of his career versus year 1. And sometimes that doesn't work. Far often more than not, they could be out of the league. Like I think the average NFL player sticks around for like 3 or 4 years when you consider all the players that come through the NFL. And so those are bets and gambles that you're making when it comes to red shirts. I want to ask you this, Lou, though. When you are thinking of red shirts, how do you typically make those decisions? I know I have my own mindset when it comes to that, and it's different with this one because we don't have limits. Like
right. I redshirt everything, more often than not, simply because I like to find different guys. Like I mentioned, the Jacoby Brissett. I'm just trying to think of guys that I grabbed off of waiver. Essentially, I call it waivers. It's not waivers. It's like a off-season auction where you get these guys for $0 more often than not, because nobody else wants them. I'm trying to think of who else I grabbed. I'd rather fill in with players like that and play that way, and save those guys. So I think for as long as I've played, and this is going back to even when I first played in the NCFF back in like 2015, like I redshirted all of those guys, Tyreek Hill, Michael Thomas, all of them year 1. Like they just all got it automatically. Here it's probably going to be a little different, because it's not only are you wagering on year 1 versus year 5, but you're also like, there may not be a year 5. If somebody has a really, if you go, okay, I'm going to save him for then, and then he performs, obviously you want him to perform well, which is why you want him that year 5. But if he performs too well, you're not going to have him for year 5 anyway. So you could have had him for 4 years, whereas now you're only going to have him for 3 usable years. So that aspect of it is new to me. So I'm not entirely sure. So now if I do grab, a Trevor Lawrence instead of that being an automatic red shirt. I think if it was a regular format and I had a quarterback, I would automatically be redshirting Trevor Lawrence. I had to think about that for a second because I'm not entirely sure, but I would probably almost every time redshirt somebody, and then make a decision later on if I had to burn them. But I think more often than not, I redshirt everything. Just because I'm never super inclined to go all in. Not in this format, at least. I like to keep that window of opportunity open. I like to say, hey, for at least 2-3 years, I'd like to be a really, really good team, and then maybe have to go through rebuilding and then get it back to where, for another 2 or 3 years, I'm really good. I don't think it's realistic to say, hey, you're going to be amazing at this every single year that you play. And at the same time, I think you can flip the script and be like, hey, I could suck at this every year I play. Like, you can never win. You could go through this and be a rookie and never win anything, no matter how hard you try. So I think ideally I'd like to go in spurts, and so to keep that window open, I stash. I think very, very rarely do I burn. I burned Justin Herbert this past year in the NCFF. And it's one of those things where I needed it because I was at one point undefeated and the top team there and having a shot at winning the conference and all that other stuff. But that's probably the only time that I would consider it. It would have to be like everything's on the line, national championship, conference title, and that's the situation that I was in. So I burned Justin Herbert. But for more often than not, you're not going to be in that where I knew right away. I think I told you, I was like, hey, like the way this is lining up, I'm gonna be.
Yeah, I got a message every Tuesday saying I got this. These are all wins. I'm not gonna.
I counted them. I just counted them. I was like, they're all wins. I mean, and that's how it was. I mean, the scheduling matched up.
Mm-hmm.
My players matched. So like I knew from very early on, and so at that point, it made playing, in those decisions, it made it a whole lot easier. And that rarely happens. And if it hadn't lined up like that, I would not have burned Justin Herbert. But more often than not, I am storing. I'm probably going to still do that here and store them and see how many times I get burned. And then once I kind of get that balance, I'll be good. But also at the same time, like I would say here, if I won Trevor Lawrence here, I'm playing Trevor Lawrence. I'm not going to redshirt him. I'm not sure how many other players, at least in this draft class, that I'd be willing to go. I'd have to wait and see where guys land. But I would say like last year, if we were doing the same rules starting with last year's rookies, I would probably say that I would play a Jonathan Taylor. I would play a CD Lamb. I would play a Justin Jefferson. I'm trying to think of who else there was.
Judy.
I don't know if I'd have played Judy.
All right.
I don't like Denver. The team that they go to, it plays a massive role in whether I'm starting them or not. I don't know if Denver's offense is ever going to be anything where Jerry Jeudy is going to be a guy that I want to burn year one.
Well, I'll say I'm a little different. I operate under when I think they're going to be the most productive. And I think the way this league is set up, I'm going to even lean into that idea a bit more. So in other leagues, I tend to redshirt quarterbacks always and wide receivers and tight ends primarily. Tight ends, if I do have them, they're always getting a red shirt because unless there's some completely unbelievable circumstance where I need them to play, they're going to get a red shirt for me just because they tend to, their year one tends to never come close to what a year 5 production is. And I think quarterbacks are similar. Again, it depends on if I have enough quarterbacks to play. So if I have other quarterbacks I can play, they're absolutely getting a red shirt. Running backs, I am way more prone to just playing them from the get-go because I think their year ones tend to be more productive than their year 5s for me, just because of the wear and tear that running backs go through. And obviously there are circumstances where if I have a stable of running backs and I'm going to use them and I'm not going to ever use this freshman, I might just redshirt that freshman because I might not ever have a use for him on the field. So those are the ways I go about it. I'm in the same mindset with you in terms of burning a red shirt. I'm not going to do it unless I have a real shot at the division. I think any real postseason success unlocks when you secure that division. You get to play in the conference championship. You've got a real legitimate shot at the national playoffs, and everything after that's just kind of a roll of the dice in terms of how far you get. And so that's when I usually will probably burn a red shirt, is if I'm in a legitimate shot late in the season to compete for the division is when I will burn a red shirt. But it's usually something no one usually takes those decisions lightly, because you know that you are probably getting less than 4 years of production now at that point. By the time you're making those decisions, you're pushing chips in, knowing that I'm only going to get 3.5, maybe really only 3 years of production for the price of this player. So
Yeah, and again, it totally depends on what you value, how you play, and the specific player. So like when Brian's talking, like he almost always plays running backs. This is because Brian's targeting like the Kamaras, the McCaffreys, like those top of tier guys. Like if Brian read off his list of running backs that he's filtered through in a similar copy of this league, that list is a million times better than if I was to read off the running backs that like I'm targeting like Ronald Jones, Joshua Kelly's, like those type of guys, because we value the position differently. And so how you value your positions is also going to depend on where you're using or how you're using your red shirts and when you're deciding to burn them or not burn them. Like if you're going up running backs for a dime or dozen, I can filter through them. You don't got to worry about that. You can either stash them or play them instantly, however it is to you. But if you're a Brian, where it's like running backs do or die, I need the top tier no matter what. You got to use them while you have them, because their life expectancy isn't what
Yeah, it's
wide
much shorter.
receivers is.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's quickly talk about medicals. We talked about them briefly, but medicals are pretty much the parachute of the league. So this is different than other formats like in CFF, where you have up to like week 9, I want to say. And you have a certain amount of starts that you get before you aren't able to play medicals. Here it's kind of a black and white line. I think it's the start of week 5, if I recall. Start of week 5. If they aren't on your IR and on MFL, they are not going to get a medical. So you essentially, maybe that might need some adjustment with the NFL's schedule change. But for right now, it's week 5. And it's like the ultimate parachute. You get to maybe 4 weeks of production out of a player, and if they go down with an injury, you get to save a year of eligibility on them, or pause it or freeze it or whatever. It's kind of you got the short end of the stick, and we realize that, and here's kind of that golden parachute that you get for getting to reuse that year of eligibility. And so we understand that this format is pretty severe, and if we didn't have that option, we would probably have to rework traditional red shirts. And the reason why we have both is because I think we really think it's a very interesting choice when it comes to freshmen, being the only traditional red shirts you can apply those to, because it's kind of like you have a very specific window and you got to use it for that to apply. And the medical just kind of eases that burden, where if some unforeseen circumstance happens, you can't control Saquon Barkley tearing his ACL in week 2. This will help recoup some of that value back. So I don't think you have much more to add on terms of that. The only thing that really stipulated, they only can be applied once. So if Saquon Barkley, if he doesn't have one now, but if he were to have already had a medical applied and tears his ACL the next year, well, that's kind of unfortunately shut out of luck when it comes to that. But
right, and you get the opportunity to here. I mean, this is the only thing that I'll add. I believe if we're doing it the same way, you get the opportunity. So like Christian McCaffrey goes down week 2. You have the opportunity to leave him as your medical red shirt, but if he comes back, week 12 or whatever, and you're like, hey, I might be in a window to win a division here or something like that, you then have to decide whether, okay, am I going to play Christian McCaffrey or do I want to save him for the following year? So you get some decision making towards the end of the season on that kind of stuff. But so it's not one of those things where, again, as long as we're operating the same way, it's not one of those things where it's like Christian McCaffrey has to stay on IR for the entire season. If he's on IR at week 5 and you put him on IR, or however we're doing that, and let's say week 9 he's activated, you can still kind of store him for a medical red shirt, if I'm correct.
No, that's correct. If you activate him off your IR, then he's not eligible. Even if you don't play him, he has to just remain on your IR for this season once he's been on there. And the reason for it is it just makes it easier for me to track. Like, I'm going to lock it at the start of week 5. No one's going to be able to futz with their IR after that point. If they want to burn it and bring him back onto their active roster, they'll just notify me and I'll move him over. but that way I know that they're making conscious decisions. They're understanding what their decisions consequences are. And that way I don't get grief on the back end. Plus, just stops people from moving back and forth with no real aim or idea.
Right, because beyond week 5, there's no point.
Yeah, there's no point. So. Yeah, so that's kind of roster composition. Next, we'll move to recruiting. Recruiting is the primary vehicle with how you are going. It's actually the only vehicle of how you're going to add players to your team. And I wanted to break it out primarily with the startup auction. A lot of you, I don't even know the number at this point. A lot of you have done a mock auction to this point. I think it's probably close to 30 or 40 people have done one of the auctions. Some have done it multiple times. I think a lot of the value with the mock auctions have so far been just getting familiar with the players that are in the pool, the way we kind of do the auction, the clock, the proxy bidding pieces. And I think all of that's important because when I put this next bullet point down is setting the expectation for when you do an auction. I don't know how many people have necessarily done an auction yet, but I think this was a great exercise to get people familiar of setting those expectations. And people who aren't familiar with auctions, they're going to quickly realize that there is people that price enforce. There are last second bidding going on during auctions that people might get frustrated about. And I think there's also infrequent participation. I think we have a few people like Angelo of Ohio Bobcats. He lives in Germany, so he's going to be participating at different hours than when Lou and I are bidding on players. And so just having those realizations and understandings, I think will help make the auction more enjoyable because you won't be so frustrated when Luigi in SEC comes in swinging at the 11th hour and just clears the board, and all your players that you had and thought you were going to get at this price are no longer going to happen. And I think that's just important to help with the enjoyment of it and not get so frustrated when you can expect those things to happen at some degree. Eventually there will be obvious reasons why those last second bids are annoying even for Lou and I, and we've played in a bunch of auctions, but I think setting the expectation is a big part when it comes to an auction. I'm sure Lou is same mindset that, if you don't know it, you're going to be frustrated, but having those expectations at the beginning makes it a much more enjoyable experience in terms of auctions, which are just fun to participate in.
Yeah. I mean, auctions are I've been looking forward to this we've talked about a version of this or a variation of this concept for years now, I think. Mm-hmm. And so this particular auction is something I'm looking forward to, but yeah, I absolutely love auctions. Having some sort of, game plan going into it is a must. I would not recommend winging it. I mean, you're absolutely more than welcome to. Sometimes it works, more often than not it doesn't. But I would have some sort of plan for this. Again, talking about all the things we've including all the things we've talked about to this point in terms of including eligibility years, positional breakdowns, all of that stuff, to at least get yourself some sort of plan, or maybe decide, do you want to go kind of all in at the quarterback position or all in at somewhere else, and get that plan kind of, you don't have to necessarily stick to it, but also, have a backup plan or have a pivot, or, if don't be, and that's the other thing, which drives me insane in auctions is you'll get guys that are like glued in, like DeAndre Swift, I'm getting him no matter what. Like, live to see another day. Like, I mean, this type of setup, like, you might be better off, getting 2 guys for what the cost is of DeAndre Swift and having one of those guys work out for you. Because more often than not, what happens in this format is the teams that win are teams that got lucky because they hit on like a Dak Prescott, who was I don't know what round he was in, 3rd, 5th, something like that, which, and most likely in his rookie auction, he either wasn't drafted or he wasn't bid on, so he was a free agent for the following season, or he went for like $5. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to have the teams that are going to win this beyond year 1 or 2 are going to be the teams that hit on prospects that are super, super deep and that they spend a couple of dollars on. Whereas, you don't go and spend $100, $200, whatever the amount is, on one guy who may not. I said N'Keal Harry earlier. So just don't be glued in on don't be glued in on one guy, or maybe tier it out. Be like, okay, so if you really like, DeAndre Swift, maybe put some other guys up in that tier and be like, okay, DeAndre Swift will be my top target. But if I don't get DeAndre Swift, I'm going to pivot to these guys here and just let DeAndre Swift go. I think that's the hardest part that people have with auctions.
So too, yeah.
Is to pivot onto something else. And so having that expectation, and then also do one of these. I mean, if Brian is still doing these mocks, sign up, because you're going to be playing with these guys. And again, if you get into one that's got a couple guys from your conference in there, it might help to see kind of how they bid or what their thought process is. And it'll get you used to last second bids drive me insane. So usually when that happens, I just reset the entire board. So anybody that's in whatever conference I'm in, if you want me to reset the entire board, go ahead and knock one of my guys off with the last second bid. Yeah, I mean, all of that stuff's part of it. I mean, it makes it fun. And at the same time, though, I would 100% be careful with some of the things you do, because if you go, you can get stuck. Like, there are a lot of, like, I think Luigi will attest to this, that you can get stuck pretty hard just by having fun and not, I don't want to say he didn't have a plan, but not having the expectation of, somebody is going to stick you with players at some point. Like, you can't win all of the first 30 players off the board. Like, it's not.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. So let some of those guys go to somebody else. So I just think if you haven't done an auction, I would 100% get into a mock, get used to the speed of it, the price point too. That's another great way. Like, I think I participated in one so long ago, I don't even remember anything about it. I've also been way too busy, but it would 100% be something that I take advantage of, because then you could also start tracking. If you were smart, you could start tracking where certain guys' price points are. And again, it's totally different once you get into there.
Yeah.
But you can at least get a better feel for it than guys that are walking in fresh off the streets. Like, those of you that are in what the hell is the name of the league? NCFF, and the guys that are in the other league, NFLU, that are the same concept. You guys probably have a way better understanding than guys that are walking in fresh to this. But there's 100% a price difference between having like a quarterback or a running back that's got 1 or 2 years left versus one that's got 4 years of eligibility left. There's a price difference between the top end and the low end, just like there would be in regular. So I mean, there are so many different variables that you probably should at least get in and try to figure it out. And also even just maybe try to build a roster, try to build out a 30-man roster. Because I think the mock I was in died out after people got like 10 or 12 players.
So that's where I pump the value of the mock themselves in terms of like really coming away with an understanding of how things are going to work, because people either didn't participate, or which even just 1 or 2 people like not bidding at all tends to depreciate like what the prices are going to be expected to be, just because of the available money that's supposed to be there. I think also the fact that people aren't taking it for real. It's an obvious mock. They know they're not going to walk away with these players, so they're trying different strategies. They know that they're more willing to let these players walk away, especially overnight. Like, I'm sure the board cleared on the first one, like incredible. Even to my shock, the first mock we did, because most of the guys in there,
off the board.
Yeah, they were coming off the board. I imagine it doesn't come that fast. This is a slow proxy auction, so if you haven't seen or done any of the mocks, this is essentially what the board will look like. It might not have these icons on it, but the name of the player, these prices, the times that they've been coming in, and how much is left on the clock with them. And I think getting familiar with that has the most value. Understanding where I'm going to find the players that I want, who's got the most money left. Those types of things are the most value in doing the mock, in terms of getting familiar, especially with the clock, and knowing when I can check in terms of how my day is working. The way that the auction's built, the idea is that it's not going to happen Not all the players are going to be off the board in like 3 days. It's going to take some time. It's built to allow people to have a level of convenience to check in one or two times a day and just put a few bids in, check the board, make sure no one's coming off at a deal that they would rather entertain. It gives players, people like Angelo that are across the world, an opportunity to play with us. So that's kind of some of the reasons why. It gives more people time to digest what's happening, see those things. The other thing I haven't mentioned, but it's a value. I will think it's a value, is that this is a public auction. And what I mean by that is you can tell who's bidding on who is price enforcing you. You can see who those teams are on the transaction pages. And I think I'm from the standpoint that if you're willing to do those things, you should be able to put your name to it. If I'm going to try to snipe you or push you up at the last second for money, I should be comfortable enough to put my name to it that you know who's doing it, because I think that gives some information on how you navigate those other teams when it comes to the auction. So if I'm playing with Lou and I know, oh crap, I just set Lou's players, and I see him come in and wreck my board, I know maybe I should let Lou, or I'm going to operate a bit differently when I'm bidding on Lou, that if I'm going to bid on players, I'm going to bid earlier on them. And that way he's not getting frustrated at the end. Or I know who's going to most likely come in and try to upbid me at the last second, so I can kind of set my proxy accordingly at the last 2 hours and say, I want to put $10 more on this player because I know Lou is going to come in at the last second and just pump him up because he wants either the board to reset or he wants me to spend more money. And if I really want that player to come off the board, I might need to put a few more dollars in. So I think that information is valuable. I think knowing where it is and accessing it is useful. I think another big thing is that you have $400. It's not coming with you at the end of the auction. So you better use it or you're going to lose it. There's some value with the walk-on piece, and we can talk about that in a second. But ultimately, you do not get any extra points for saving $200. This is in a salary cap league, so you have this money. You will get more money next year to bid on players, but it's not going to be coming. There's nothing that's going to roll over. There's no bankroll, anything like that. So make sure you are effectively using your $400 for the startup. I don't want to hear people saying, oh, well, I was anticipating this to happen, because it's not. This is the $400 you get. Make sure you budget it wisely. It doesn't mean spend $200 on one player, because you'll end up hurting yourself maybe in a different capacity, but it also means waiting too long or not participating the first week might mean that a lot of really cheap deals come off and you're ended up with money that you could have spent elsewhere. So those are some things I want to make sure people understand. Proxy system in MFL
we need to go over that.
Yeah, it is incredibly important. If you look at the second column in this picture, there's a current bid and proxy bid. When you are bidding on teams, there will be a parentheses amount around how much your proxy you have set. So if you are setting bids in these white spaces here, or when you're nominating a player, you will start at, if you nominate a player for $30 right at the get-go, they will start out at $0. Your proxy bid is now $30. And as people bid on that player, it will start inching up closer to your proxy. If it goes over that $30, it will reset who's the highest bidder on that team, and the clock for that player will reset with the team that just went over you. It's important to notice this because proxy allows us to have a lot of flexibility when it comes to auctioning. You can set things, not feel like you have to constantly check in, but it also gives you the ability to be really aggressive when it comes to bidding on players that you really want. Let's say I want Justin Herbert. I know what I want to pay. I'm going to put him up here and see if anyone comes close to matching. Because if, let's say, you set your proxy for Justin Herbert at $100 and everyone comes up to the price line of $85, guess what? You get to walk away with Justin Herbert at $85, and you got him off maybe at an expeditious time of 12 hours, whereas other players have been ticky-tacky, $1 here, $1 there, and they sit on the board for a week.
Right.
So proxy system has a lot of advantages. The other thing I want to advocate with proxy is that when you are putting proxies down, that money is tied up. So you are essentially allocating that dollar amount to that player. And so when you are spending it on multiple players on the board, you are thinning out your entire budget on maybe not effectively using it immensely. But when things get when money starts drawing down and you can't spend all the money everywhere, this becomes the point where you have to kind of make those decisions. Who am I going to let off the board, or am I going to have to adjust the proxies that I have on these players to be closer to what the current bid is, so I get more money to use elsewhere? So proxies have some give and take. There's a bit of strategy to how to use them, and some of it's just getting familiar with MFL system if you haven't used it before. But there's a lot of advantages to using it, I think, in either way that you use it. And I'm sure you agree with that.
Yeah, I don't think that. I mean, there's maybe one disadvantage that I can think of, and maybe I'll hit on it. But sort of to Brian's point, so we have a $400 budget. If you put a $100 proxy bid on 4 players, you aren't going to be able to bid on anybody else. The system will not let you bid on anybody else because your $400 is tied up. So to do that, what Brian's talking about, you can go in and bid essentially against yourself. And you can do this the same way too if you want to raise your bid. So if you have $100 on Chase Claypool and you realize that you need to lower that, you just bid over here on the right hand side in that thing, and you'd write $50. So then it automatically refreshes Chase Claypool. It drops him down his proxy to $50. It doesn't reset his time. It doesn't do anything like that. But what it does do is now give you that other $50 credited back where you can now bid with that. When you're lowering your proxy, you can get as low as, so like if we were looking at this board right now, there's $1 difference. So if you wanted to lower Chase Claypool's proxy on this board, he's at 33. The lowest you can bring him down to is 34. So, and this happens, I mean, I think I get 1 or 2 of these every single auction. We might get more here because there's 100 people, where people go, oh crap, like I messed up on Chase Claypool. I put $300 on him instead of 30. Just, you can automatically lower it yourself. Just type in 30 and it'll rebid against your 300. Super, super easy. And it's the same deal too. So like if you've got Chase Claypool and he's at $35 and you see that he's at 33, he's starting to creep up, you get panic. You just type in 50 next to that. It's not going to reset your clock or anything. And it just resets your proxy. I will tell you this, that I believe this works the same way as the public enforcement. When you do that, I believe it puts in the transaction report that you've changed the proxy. Brian, I'm fairly certain it does. It used to do it that way, and I'm fairly certain it does. So we'll have to, I'll check on that. Brian and I'll play with it, and maybe I'll put it out in the next one we do. We'll get an answer for that. But it used to notify, like it would say like, hey, so-and-so bid on Chase Claypool, and you could go look and see that that was the current high bidder on Chase Claypool. So more often than not, that was a proxy adjustment. It used to do that. I haven't noticed that it does, but yeah. I haven't paid attention in a long time. I know it used to do that, so I just kind of be careful. Maybe we'll test that and get a final answer. But then again, the only other downside of the proxy bid that I've seen, and we won't see this in the startup auction, but we will see it in the rookie auction when teams will kind of target specific players for their thing. If you put, so guys, is it a $400 for the rookie, or is it going to be the 100?
No, it's going to be 200.
200.
So 200 plus some other things.
Yeah. So essentially, like, kind of what happens is once the rookie, we get into a groove with that, positions will take on certain price points. With the $200 price point, I can't imagine we get too many rookies going for the full $200. We might get some. I don't know. I mean, we've not played it, so we might. But it's some of the other formats that Brian and I play. At the $100 maximum, we have seen players go. We've actually seen a couple go for over 100, I think.
Yeah, they did. They had a transfer budget added on, and so yeah. But I know what you're saying.
Yeah, so you see guys go for that full amount. So if you target a guy and you decide that guy is going to be yours no matter what, and you want to put your full proxy on them, you got to get them in first, because if somebody beats you to that and decides to go right to that proxy, whoever's got the full max proxy bet on it is going to be the guy that wins him. And at the same time, if you lock it in and then walk away and never log into the auction again, smart owners are going to look and say, oh, so-and-so hasn't logged in for 3 days. He's still got Joe Burrow on the board. It's most likely a max proxy, and you can jump it up. You can keep bidding it up. Whereas, then when he shows up, you might realize like, oh, hey, I got kind of close to that proxy there. But yeah, those are my two probably points on the proxy would be like, if there was ever a player that was going to go for a max price. It's whoever gets the max proxy in first gets that player. And then it's with the same deal. Like if you send it in and send the check for, $200 for one player, teams will catch on that you are not actively bidding or not actively participating or talking or logging in, and they will up your proxy to almost that entire max. Whereas you could have gotten a player for a fraction of the price if you just kind of faked it, like actively showed up. So other than that, I think it's all positives to the proxies. I would 100% recommend it, because more often than not, if you identify the price range and put a realistic proxy on a player, you're going to get that player much cheaper than you would have if you nickeled and dimed it the whole way up. If you just kind of start, especially out of the gate in the startup, I mean, if you can identify where that price point is, put a somewhat realistic, maybe even a slightly high at the time proxy on that player is going to go much cheaper than they would nickel and diming later on in the auction. I 100% guarantee that.
Yeah. The other thing that I don't think people maybe have done before, but it's something worth noting, is that since there's two copies, the player pool on MFL won't show another copy if there's one on the board. So if there's a CD Lamb or Chase Claypool, like let's use this example since we've used them a few times. If there were teams that had the ability to nominate players still, they would not see Chase Claypool available. And that's an MFL enforced system. They don't allow you to put two of the same copy on the board. I think it's whatever to do with their servers, and how their system works. But that kind of is something to keep in mind when you're playing, because oftentimes I don't really think MFL does the greatest job with this, is letting you know who's available, especially when you've used up your nominations. It just kind of reduces the pool to no one. You can't see who's still available. But it's worth noting that there's two copies of these players. So if you see these boards, it's not worth getting infatuated over a player, because there could be another copy coming in the next day. And it's worth sometimes holding back in reserve, but there's also times it's worth being aggressive on those points. Last thing I'll mention is that the $400, you can use that. As we've said, we don't know if we would see a lot of teams go the full 30 with the roster. I also don't know if we see teams use the full $400 for even the 25 players. They might use their full $400 on 15, 18 players, and then use the rest of their roster spots on walk-ons. And walk-ons are essentially players that are won for $0. They can be bid for free. So the minimum amount you can put in an auction on a player is $0. And they can be won, and you can have them on your team for nothing. So you can grab these players near the end of the auction when money is getting lower and put players out. And if everyone's out of money, then it's pretty much a first come, first serve type system where you put them on the board and you get that player. So the auction will continue to run after we've had most of the money spent. There might be maybe a freeze period where we just kind of give people a day to digest and say, all right, everyone's really spent their money. I'm going to open up the nominations to, you can fill out the board as you see fit, just to expedite that process. But I usually don't do that till there's probably like 90% of all the money spent in an auction. So it'll take a while. But those are kind of the systems in place. I expect people to be somewhat aggressive with this startup. I don't know about you, Lou. There's going to be a lot of money flying around. I think there's a lot of eager people that want to play in this format, try things out, finally get a team together. I've written down at the bottom here, this table, just kind of some logical things to think about when you're in an auction. One is the amount of available money oftentimes dictates price. So the more money that people have, the more the price, the higher the price is going to be for a player. So if the entire auction has their full budget, the prices are obviously going to be higher. Near the end of the auction, when people don't have money, the prices are going to be lower. Different things happen when, like we've mentioned routinely before, where someone spends all of their money on like one or two players and they're effectively out of the auction. Well, they can no longer spend that money on other players. And usually you see a price drop happen with the rest of the board, because there's one less person that has money to spend on other players. So the more that people tie money up on a few amount of players, means usually the price will come down a lot faster. Whereas if everyone has got a lot of money and everyone's kind of getting the prices that they want, well, they're going to have more money for a longer period of time, and those prices will eventually come up to a point where they weren't at the same price point as what you thought they were. The other thing I want to mention is eligibility. Lou mentioned it earlier, but you are paying for potential years of production. There should be no reason that a player like Lamar Jackson is going to be going for the same amount as like Justin Herbert. As good as Lamar Jackson is, they're comparable talents, but you're only going to get 1 year of Lamar Jackson versus probably 2 years of Justin Herbert. So there is a disparity in terms of what you should be paying for those prices. I think when I've done some analysis, it's actually kind of neat that it comes down. I think most of the prices, when you consider eligibility, you lose a fourth of the price with each year of eligibility off at comparable talents. So like if you value Lamar Jackson and Justin Herbert, Lamar Jackson should be maybe about half of what Justin Herbert is going to go for, because you're only getting 1 year versus 2 or 3. So things to consider when it comes to eligibility: 4 years of production is probably going to have higher price points than 1 year for obvious reasons, because you are paying for years of production. The other thing to consider is nominated players. We didn't really talk about this, but you get 2 nominations at any time. You get more nominations as the players that you had nominated come off the board. So if Miami, Ohio up here had nominated Chase Claypool and Tua Tagovailoa as its 2 nominations, he is not going to have any more nominations until those 2 players come off the board. If those players even get reset and he is no longer the highest bidder like he is in this instance, he still cannot nominate new players. He will still have those nominations tied up until those 2 players come off the board. That is important to note. The other thing to note, I don't know if I verified this, but I'm pretty sure this is understanding. If you own players, let's say Miami, Ohio wins Chase Claypool, he cannot nominate on Chase Claypool again. I think that's an MFL enforced
MFL will not let him price enforce on Chase Claypool. Yep. Will not let him nominate on Chase Claypool. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else, but yeah, MFL will not. Chase Claypool will show up on the auction board for you. He will not show up underneath. But when you go in to try to bid on Chase Claypool, it will error code you and essentially tell you already have this player, you can't bid on him. Yep. Just because it's not good. Because essentially what will happen if you run the risk of, if you were to win that player, you break the league. So just to stop that, the error code will come up. So, I mean, that's an MFL thing. So that won't happen either. That goes for any player or just about any instance where you would break something, where the roster limits break or the money breaks or whatever. It is going to error code you and not let you do it. That this is one of the instances where, with how we have the league set up, you break it, so it's not going to let you do that.
Nominated players, there's some strategy in terms of how you nominate players. Oftentimes, if there are more players on the board, that means a lot more options to throw money around, and money is tied up. So sometimes prices come down. But if you want people to spend their money on a few players, get those prices really high, you sometimes maybe reserve and not nominate the players that you want, because then you want them to keep cycling. People get agitated. People want to spend the money. And they will put it on few players and use up their money, where then as you put more players on the board, those are at cheaper prices. So there's some strategy in terms of how you use your nominations. I'm not going to adjust nominations, even if people are crying, bitching, moaning on terms of who is using their nominations or not, because I understand there is some strategic element to it. I'm only going to change nominations in terms of how many you get until way later in the auction when pretty much everyone's done. So that's just a forewarning. I'm not going to make any of those adjustments in the auction. How about let's talk about a little bit about following years, Lou, just very briefly. We've talked about it a bit, but moving after year 1, moving into year 2, when we have auctions coming up, I fully expect that the shift in terms of how people pay their money is going to be heavily dictated by the freshmen that are incoming, that they are the primary focus. This is how you get really new talent on your team. And this is pretty much dictates how you stay youthful, how you extend your windows longer in terms of competing, is by getting valuable freshmen in. So oftentimes you see the amount of money that people want to spend being really geared towards the freshmen that are available, and they are oftentimes way more aggressive with freshmen in those auctions. Those top tier talents, they really want them because they are valuable. I also think schools' needs are going to change. There are going to be teams that aren't in the driver's seat to compete. In the startup, everyone's kind of got an equal chance at winning until the dust settles. But at the beginning of recruiting auctions, that's not going to necessarily be the case. There are going to be absolutely teams that are in better position to compete, and there are going to be teams that are probably looking at a year or two away of just being patient and rebuilding and acquiring as much talent as possible. And those types of things dictate the price of how things change. The last thing, and I'm not sure how this adjusts because I don't think I've ever really played in a format like this in an extended period, is where budgets kind of are adjusting based on how well you did last year. So there are a few ways you can gain more money to your budget from previous season. That includes wins, players awards, coach of the year award, other types of things. And that can increase teams' budgets where they have more ability to gain more players or spend more on a player. And how that dynamic works out is going to obviously change how those auctions play out in future years. But do you have anything else that would necessarily happen?
So kind of I'll hit on maybe a little bit of what's missing from Brian's yellow chart here and apply it to following years. So one of the things that will also happen in following years will be teams should, in theory, start getting closer and closer to that. If they're not already at that point, should get closer and closer to the 30 roster max. And so when that happens, that also changes the pricing of players throughout the auction. Because teams will either have to make a decision to drop a guy or they don't want to drop. And so you can get less teams bidding if teams are already filled up. Or if, some teams are only going to have 1 or 2 spots available and other teams are going to have 6 or 8 spots available. So that's something that changes year to year as well is the number of players that are actually able to be won. Other than that, school needs change obviously all the time. I mean, again, that also depends on how you play. I mean, your needs may not be what others think they are or what you think they are if you value things differently. I don't think I've ever been one to go, these are my needs, this is what I'm going to target. I think I did it once and I ended up spending a crap ton of money on Kyler Murray. It ended up working, but I don't think I would do it again. And I don't think I've ever done it outside of that point. I'm more of looking for the deal or looking for depth or just looking to collect general pieces more so than targeting need, because when you target need, if you miss on that, you put yourself in a bigger hole. So I'd rather throw the net out and see what I catch rather than go for that. But I would 100% agree with everything that you're saying here. The freshman is the main focus point, unless you get a really I mean it happens. Like there's one division in NCFF that is so stupid. I mean it's stupid. It's so weird that they all do the same strategy where they all drop their upperclassmen that are still eligible in transfers and then they transfer them out, and then they spend a crap ton of money shuffling around older talent. I don't know why they do it. They do it every year and it just happens. So we're saying all this stuff and you could turn around and be in the division that's dropping, the top tier talent every year to try to gain more money. But then they're also turning around and spending that money on veterans that it shouldn't happen that way. And again, it's not necessarily wrong that it does. I mean, they do it. But you could get in a weird conference that does that with the transfers, but more often than not, there aren't a crap ton of useful transfer players or stars. I'll put those guys, the guys that they're drafting are top end talent. I would think for the most part, they're dropping guys like Michael Thomas and I'm trying to think of who else they drop, but those top end guys that get dropped, that typically doesn't happen, but it could. And so, I mean, those guys are going to make an impact.
Yeah. And we'll talk about transfers in just a second, because there's a lot of nuance in terms of how transfers work and when they're valuable, and we'll get to it. But very, very quickly, this is just a chart of very, very basic understanding of what I would kind of think that the startup auction prices are going to kind of look like. That they're going to be these huge curves to them, that some of these running back positions might hold their price a little bit more, and that wide receiver tight ends kind of have the longer tail because they have more depth to them. It's not a, I think I use it better as a barometer of when not to get too crazy with spending, that there should not be more than a couple players that are maybe over $100 is how I view this. That there are very specific talents that are probably going to go for that much. And once those players are acquired, that the price for the rest of them should come down faster, because the two or three people that really wanted that player, one of them had acquired them. So that takes a third or half or however many players or people are interested out of the equation, and those prices should come down. So this is just kind of a rough estimate of what I think the prices are. This is obviously not determining eligibility when it comes to these things. It's not determining the player themselves and the talent they are, but this is just looking at kind of basic point totals and how they stack up over the last like 3 years, and what you should probably be spending for them. So it's just kind of a rough gauge. I wanted to give it to people in the event that they don't feel like, do I really need to spend $200 for this player? No, you shouldn't. It probably doesn't make sense to do that. And whoever is doing it, you should let them walk away with the player at that price, because ultimately it's going to probably hurt them long term. So,
and when Brian does this, it very rarely works out this way. In theory, this is 100%. Everybody that's watching it, 100%. This is probably accurate. And I don't know who the running back is. It's 150. That's probably still high. That's probably still high for me. I mean, these numbers are high for me too, looking at it. Like, I don't know how many guys I would go over like $80 for, let alone 100 to, somebody's going over $150 here. In theory, if this worked 100% or it was efficient and everybody got the right prices, this is what it would look like. But I am willing to bet that we get at least a handful of at each position that go over $100, simply because if the wrong guy, and that's typically what happens, is the wrong guy, two people will fall in love with the wrong guy and push him to that $100 threshold. And then what happens is, when the real guy that should be there comes to that point, he's going to get bumped again and then bumped again. And so
I think it comes back to also the fact that a lot of these auctions, especially people that are new to the format, don't let the players off the board.
Right.
100%. Like they can't let them go for even any price, because I think it's maybe a lack of knowledge, but also maybe a lack of understanding, that there takes a real level of patience to let players off the board. And when you're first doing this, you're all hyped up, you're amped, you want to get these things, you want to get these players, especially because you've played in maybe a format that's just normal dynasty. And you think, yeah, Justin Jefferson, an incredible player, I need to have him on my team. But when he gets to these prices, it's not necessarily to the value of what other players you could get at different price points to help round out your team. Because these rosters are a bit deeper than like NCFF or NFLU is probably pretty comparable, and just because of the size, but they have right. IDP included. But those things, it's something worth noting that oftentimes the prices get squished up against each other because often people just can't let the players go. Right. And we really want to make sure that there's a balance. There's an equilibrium point where you want to let players go and when you don't, because oftentimes if you let them go too soon or too cheaply, it means you're either spending more money down the line, or everyone got a deal and everyone's kind of the same team. So there's a lot to consider when it comes to auctions. People might think it's a bit overbearing and a bit much, but I think oftentimes once you just do it a few times, you get kind of those basic understandings and they'll all get very familiar. Transfers, Lou talked about. We had this notorious division in NCFF that love to kick their upperclassmen out the door, because they thought they were going to get value for it. And what I wanted to do is make sure to set the expectation of when does it make sense to kind of cut a player for transfers. There are a lot of factors when you want to cut a player. This is kind of how you do trading in this league. And that's such a bad term to use, but it's about the only equivalency I can do for people that haven't played in the format before. Um, Transfers are essentially how you get more money for players that you let go. And this doesn't make sense when it comes to real college football because teams don't recoup money from transfers. They're letting talent walk out the door for usually nothing. And but that's not the case. This is a way to let teams rebuild or find avenues to capitalize on their depth and get more money in for new recruits, whatever you want to say. But I wanted to at least kind of preface when to kind of consider cutting players because there's definitely a right time and there's definitely a wrong time, in my opinion. So I think there's a value, there's a point of the time of year. I'm never going to cut a player until right before the deadline because there's usually no value in doing that. I'm sure you agree, Lou, that there's no value in cutting a player in this league until the transfer deadline because there's nothing you can recoup in value. They can only lose value because something like Deshaun Watson news come out and now that player's wrecked and you don't have them on your team. You'd have to buy them back in the auction. You can't re-add them once you cut them unless they're in the auction. So that is something to consider is when you cut them. Don't cut them too soon because you might end up ruining their value when they could have just sat on your team or found another way or their price changes, whatever. There are different types of players that are worth transferring. I wouldn't go into this thinking that I'm going to transfer some third string tight end because he is not going to fetch a price. And if I'm expecting to get money back for him, I'm probably going to be in for a rude awakening. The other thing to really consider is flooding the market. This comes back to the idea of what this other group is that when everyone throws their upperclassmen into the pool, that saturates the market and the price for all those players comes down to the point where either no one wants to spend that money to get those players because they all thought they were either going to be, kicking the can down the road and not competing this year, or they just don't want to keep spending on seniors. So when flooding the market happens, I usually think no one wins. And so there's oftentimes gauging when the market is saturated to a point. Sometimes you kind of do it to screw over other people that might be transferring other players, but that you might be competing with. But oftentimes I think flooding the market has less and less value for things. So what I wanted to do is just kind of go through some scenarios and when I would think of transferring someone. So I put them up in the top right as kind of an idea as if I had a senior wide receiver and I think of an instance like a Tyreek Hill type player. They're on a bad team. They didn't win a lot of games. They're not projected to win a lot of games this season, but they're highly productive. They were scoring as the wide receiver 1 last year, and there's no other players that are comparable in the transfer market to that value. As a team that's really bad and has a talent like that on there, and they're going to walk out the door regardless next year, they are probably a high likely transfer candidate I would want to consider. I might kick them out the door, see what value I can get, recoup those funds, and ultimately walk into that freshman auction with more money to spend on usable assets. When as you compare it to maybe like a junior quarterback where the quarterback position is highly valuable. They are a competing team, but this might be a depth piece, and there are other talented transfers in the market. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Even if a player is a quarterback, it might still make sense to keep them as that depth piece because injuries could happen. You could have, I don't know, Joe Burrow go down in the middle of the season. You were a competing team. You might need a player like a Baker Mayfield on your team to kind of get you to the division and either hold you over till Burrow's back or kind of just try to carry and roll the dice and get you through as much as you can. So there are instances where you want to consider where your team is at. And then another instance is like a sophomore running back. They're a middling team. They're in the middle of the division. They might not compete this year. They might, but it's the top player at their position. And there's no other comparable players on the transfer market at that time. It might make sense to transfer them. You might get a lot of money back for them because they have a lot of eligibility. They're productive, but it also might not. You could be just a year away from competing. You could have just a really good recruiting class that's coming up that year. And that player like a Miles Sanders could be incredibly valuable to get you that division title or conference championship. So I put an asterisk underneath these. These are examples that can be argued either way if you really think about it. It's kind of similar to how you would consider, is a trade winner make sense? Did I win this trade? Did I lose this trade? These types of things can be kind of overlaid in terms of when you make a transfer decision or not. And I'm sure that makes sense to you, Lou.
Yeah. And again, I mean, some of this stuff's on here, so Brian's going to get to it. Each situation is different, so it really depends on the state of your team. And you have to be realistic with that. Like, the state of your team, is your team ass essentially, or is your team going to compete? Are you going to have the pieces to compete? Does dropping a quarterback like Baker Mayfield, like, you have to be realistic with like what that guy's going to return. Like Baker Mayfield, like, how many people are going to be truly excited that Baker Mayfield is going to be their quarterback? Like if somebody needs Baker Mayfield, that's great. But at the same time, like, are they going to be over enthusiastic about being like, hey, I'm going to drop $20 on Baker Mayfield and you get the credit, whatever that number is, back to you? You just kind of have to be realistic with those things. I don't think I participate in transfers. I mean, I don't know about you. I think it's something where more often than not, I find that the player is more valuable on my squad than they are going into the transfer portal. I think the only scenario that would apply to me would be the first one with a Tyreek Hill on a bad team with a top receiver and no comparison to the transfer. That's probably but my team's never bad. So I try to say it with as straight as a face as possible. But I mean, like I've never been in that situation where my team sucks and I have to transfer somebody. So with the exception of NFLU, but I'm messing around with some stuff there. And I transferred out Christian McCaffrey and got a crap ton of money for him. But again, that would be what this situation is. I had the top running back. I was going to lose him this year anyways. He was on IR when I put him on there. He stayed on IR for the whole season. So the person that got him never used him and paid a lot of money for him. So I mean, it was almost that exact scenario. And again, that was it. I mean, that's probably the only time, like, to me, like, going down this list, Baker Mayfield with a competing team as a depth piece, I'd probably rather have Baker Mayfield. Miles Sanders, middle of the pack team, he's my best option. I mean, that's almost like my NCFF team. I've got Miles Sanders. He's my RB2, I think.
Well, as you told us on this podcast already, you have Christian McCaffrey for 2 more years.
Yeah. So, and I have Miles Sanders as well. I have a whole bunch. I have great players. It's a great team, great players. I'm set up to win again, back to back. But Miles Sanders, I wouldn't. I wouldn't transfer him anyways. But that's just how I play. And again, like, there are people that could 100% come in here and go, all right, I'm transferring all 3 of these guys. So again, it just is, you have to be realistic with your team and be realistic with your division. Because again, each division is going to have its own, like, vibes. You might get one where nobody wants any of those, doesn't want to participate in the transfer portal. Because the other thing too is, if these guys don't get one, they go into the walk-on period and they can get one for practically nothing, which is kind of where Brian was talking about, like, don't put your tight ends in here, don't put your depth pieces in here, because you're probably not going to fetch a price for them, because smart owners know if they just wait and let them sit, they're gonna, they can get them for free essentially, and after the auction. The other thing too, you're allowed to bid on your player, right? So, like, if you drop Tyreek Hill, you can re-win Tyreek Hill. So with the public auction, pay attention to who's bidding on the transfers, because if you're getting bid up by the guy who dropped him, stick him with that guy, because he's gonna not only lose out on the money he would have won.
Yeah, he doesn't.
He's gonna have to. It's gonna cause him, money long term. So pay attention especially with the transfers, with those upperclassmen. Pay attention to who's bidding. That's probably the most important thing. Because if it's only you and the guy, if there's only 2 people and it's you and the guy that had him already, it's not worth, even though it would be amazing to have Tyreek Hill for a year for a team that's competing, it is way more satisfying to stick the guy that had Tyreek Hill back with Tyreek Hill. I am 100% certain that it is more satisfying to do that than it is to win a national championship. I will go on record with that.
Yeah, I call it the Jake P rule, or the Jake P phenomenon, when you get to stick the player when they come snooping around and try to upbid them for more money, and they ultimately end up back with that player, because it's the twofold problem. You made a mention of it. They don't get the money back. Like, they were thinking they were going to get money that is going to add to their budget. Now they're not getting that. Plus, they're going to be spending already from that budget for whatever goes for that player. So they're losing a lot more by that risk. And that's why I allow those things to happen, is because of that risk. They could ultimately end up with those things. And it's just kind of gauging that market, understanding who is potentially snooping around and doing those things, is valuable. The other thing I'll put down this lower table is kind of the same ideas with the auction thing, is that the number of potential buyers, if you were contemplating Tyreek Hill or Baker Mayfield, ultimately, if you can identify who those potential buyers might be ahead of time, you can probably estimate what those prices of those players will go for. So if you see two teams that are on the cusp of competing, and you have like a player like Kyler Murray that's not going to help your team for the next 2 seasons or whatever, maybe you throw Kyler Murray out because there might be a frenzy that happens, and the price that you get back for Kyler Murray might go through the roof. And that might make sense to do those things. But if the number of buyers is not there, everyone's got the equal amount, or you know that the conference mates in your team don't like to spend on upperclassmen, like me and Lou are pretty notorious for not wanting to spend on upperclassmen. We'd rather save our money for freshmen. Knowing that, maybe it doesn't make sense to transfer that player, because I know I'm not going to have as many suitors for whoever I put out there. The next is the number of transfers. The more talent available, the more diluted the return. The more Tyreek Hills that are out on the board, the more chances all those buyers that are out have a chance of getting Tyreek Hill. So they're not going to spend as much. It's clearly a supply and demand dynamic, and something to be very considerate of when you are contemplating this. That's why I also say don't list your transfers until the last second, because you don't want to see the board be diluted well ahead of time and then just knowingly throw your player in and say, oh crap, I didn't realize that market is completely diluted. The other thing to really consider is the incoming talent of the freshmen. So me and Lou are very pro, we want to spend our money on freshmen, but also the talent of the incoming freshman class dictates usually how much money is going to be spent on transfers. The more talented they are, the less money is going to be spent on upperclassmen. That's usually just how that works. So gauging who the incoming class is, and know that you think you're going to be getting a big return, but if some of those factors don't line up and people really just want to save that money for freshmen, well, you just threw a really valuable player out. Someone got him for super cheap, and now they even have still money left over to go back into the freshman auction and be a competitor against you. So those things are things to consider when you're contemplating transfers. Another thing to note is, and we'll talk about player instigated transfers in a second, is that any player that you cut on your own has a 50% return. So you are not going to get the full amount of what that player goes for. So if Tyreek Hill goes for $50, you're only getting 25% back.
$25.
Yep, $25. Sorry. And it will be rounded up to the nearest dollar. So if they go for like 27, it'll go for $14. So those things are something to consider when you're contemplating what kind of price I'm going to get back for it, and is it worth it? Is getting $10 back for a Baker Mayfield more valuable than getting a depth piece at quarterback? Probably not. Player instigated transfers. There are things in the rules that dictate if a player is not used, a talented player is not used in the season effectively, they will opt out and ask for a transfer on their own. There is ability to, I think it's like $20 to retain that player that you have to pay. But how you use players in the season might mean if they try to jump ship to another team in the off season. So if I have a Josh Allen who scored as the top quarterback last year, I didn't play him more than 2 games. in real life, that player would want a shot at playing at a different school. And with the new NCAA rules that are coming down, they'd be shooting out the door a lot faster than probably what would be happening in this league. But there are things to consider when how you use them. You would obviously want to be playing your more productive players. There's no reason not to. Tanking doesn't really get you anything in this league. Not setting the best optimal lineup doesn't really get you anything in this league. It probably hampers you more than anything. So there's something to consider. The one thing I will say is when I wrote these rules, I didn't realize this, is that there's kind of this built-in loophole with it all. If there's a player that you have a super talented team, he just doesn't get the field. Let's say you have a great set of wide receivers and you just can't find a way to play the fourth wide receiver the requisite amount of games for whatever reason. You just don't pay attention. You don't want to. He goes into the transfer. You have the option to pay them $20, $10, or $5. If they were a top 16, let's say, it's a $10 cost. You could essentially let them go into the transfer pool. You still have the ability to bid on them. You could bid onto that player up to $10 because you would ultimately be paying that anyway. And then anyone that bids over, you are getting back 100% of the returns on player instigated transfers. So if I have, let's use CeeDee Lamb. Let's say I don't play CeeDee Lamb enough. He goes into the auction. He's a top 16 player. I'm going to put $10 on him. Lou comes back in and bids 11. And maybe other people bid and they bid him up to $30. I get the full $30 for player instigated transfers. Those are 100% returns. But if Lou or everyone else doesn't come back, doesn't spend any money on CD, and I've put the $10 down, I get CD back on my team for the same amount as I would if I was going to ultimately let him go. So there is this kind of like loophole where you can spend the amount, but you also have the option to get more for a player that initiates a transfer themselves. So that's kind
I'm
of
excited about that, by the way. That's a new wrinkle. That's something that I think we worked on for quite a while.
Yeah.
On trying to figure out how to do this. So I'm excited about this. I don't think we've had this anywhere.
I haven't seen it anywhere, but
it should be interesting. And again, as for it being a potential loophole, I mean, as long as everybody's aware of what's going on and is working under this same set of rules, there's no problem with it. I mean, it's essentially like, and again, and if you don't bump your player, like if you didn't bump your CeeDee Lamb to $10, like that's on you. Like everybody should at least for the most part be doing that. And then from there, everybody has the conscious decision to go, okay, well, you know what? To me, CeeDee Lamb might be worth $12. Or $13. I don't care if Brian gets the full 13. It's more valuable to me to have CeeDee Lamb. And again, I'm not sure how often this is going to apply or how many of these we're going to have. Up front, we probably year one, we'll probably have more, I would think, or year one transitioning into year two.
Probably less.
Well, why would we have less?
Less of these player instigated ones because there's the pool.
Oh yeah. Right. We would have probably less now than what we would have down the road. So ideally, as we get established and teams get built, like you'll see some teams should more likely than not, some teams will separate themselves from the pack and build up these positional depth, where they've got, like Brian had this past season, Kamara. I don't even know who you had. I can't even remember Kamara. Like I saw you have Dobbins everywhere. You had
didn't have Dobbins. I had Kamara, Chubb, Mixon, and Dalvin Cook all on the same team.
Right. And so part of this was like, and again, this was one of the things where I don't know, I can't remember who advocated for this, or me or you, but that's part of the reason, because Brian essentially has the ability now to, I think for the most part, you were starting Cook and Kamara the entire season. You're just sitting on the other guys. And so this kind of puts a little bit more, instead of like mailing in your lineup submission, you got to put maybe a little thought. Okay, I'd like to keep Nick Chubb around. Maybe Mixon I'm not as worried about, but now I got to find a way to rotate Nick Chubb in there. Maybe play some matchups, do some things. And again, it's anything that adds strategy, I'm all for. And so this is one of the things that I'm super excited to see kind of how this pans out. over the years and kind of affects decision making and rosters and all the other stuff. Compiled with the fact that you also get to do transfers, so I think that that's probably an aspect to keep an eye on. How many player instigated transfers are coming out? After we kind of get established, you might be able to go, okay, there's 8% player instigated transfers across the league every single year, and so you could be able to go, okay, there's still room there for team oriented transfers to where I can drop a guy into the transfer pool and still get some money. But you might see a spike in that. Maybe one year you see a 25% player instigated transfers. So it may not be as wise to go ahead and throw your own transfers out into that pool if it's already a pretty good looking player instigated pool.
Yeah, and the other thing to consider when doing transfers is the dynamic of who's getting the money back and who's spending the money, because ultimately it will dictate back to the other auctions of how much money they have available to spend on rookies and incoming freshmen. So if there's more player instigated transfers, they're getting 100% back. I know they're going to be a lot more aggressive when it comes to the freshman recruiting auctions. So stuff to consider when you're spending the money, that it's kind of a give and take. Someone's getting something, you're getting something, and it's just something. The last thing I think we'll talk about tonight is very quickly just the idea of this Devi piece. A lot of people have asked questions about it. I wanted to talk. It's new to us on how this is going to work, and the idea behind it was to kind of reward people that identify talent or identify talent early enough, and that have a idea or enjoy Devi is one of the things that we've explored. The other thing is that it gives us just a thing to touch base on during the in-season activity, that we have this draft for Devi players. And it's kind of just allows people to circumvent, and even if they don't have a team that's competing, they have something to do, because there aren't trades, there's no waivers in season. It's pretty much just setting your lineup and seeing how the rankings work out and on all these things. So there's a lot less things to do in season, but we wanted to add something to kind of keep people engaged, especially if they know they're not going to be competing for the national championship. So just as a reminder how Devi works in this format, there is a Devi draft in season. This is essentially you drafting the right to a player, and that player right now accounts for both copies of them. So if I'm drafting Trevor Lawrence in a Devi auction or a Devi draft, I have the rights to him. Right, I want to be careful how I phrase this. The rights to his rebate for both copies. So when it comes to that next off season, there is an auction at the very beginning of the freshman piece. I put all the players that were selected in the draft nominated up for the auction. And the reason why I do it up at the very beginning of the freshman piece is that this gives me the highest chance and highest visibility of getting the rebate money back to you while the auction is still going. If we didn't do this, it would probably lead to me missing some opportunities to get you money back. But ultimately, it's a rebate system. So I drafted Trevor Lawrence. I hold his rights to a rebate. If I were to acquire one of the two copies of Trevor Lawrence in that auction, I get an up to $20 rebate on the price of whatever he went for. So if I got Trevor Lawrence for $100 in the auction, I effectively will have paid $80 for him. Whereas if someone else outbid me, they would be spending the full 100. And this is just kind of giving you a rebate for identifying Trevor Lawrence as the valuable piece that you wanted, and getting some sort of compensation for that. And I said up to $20. So if the player did not have a dollar amount as the final bid in the auction greater than $20, it'll be an up to, so that it'll essentially be free. So if I want a player for $10 in the auction that I had the right to a rebate on, they would essentially come back to me for free as almost like a walk-on. The way I kind of view this at the very beginning working, as I see this as a way of bad teams kind of getting an early leg up on acquiring maybe more coveted talent. And this is kind of a balanced perspective that bad teams aren't going to have a lot of the bonus dollar amounts from like wins, player awards that really good competing teams do. But this maybe gives them a leg up where they can extend a little further in the auction to spend on more coveted talent and get that compensation back for a Trevor Lawrence type player, because they might not have the full like $240 budget that a good, really good team has.
Yeah, I don't know if I see it playing out like that. I would probably say like, so to me, if this was Trevor Lawrence at $100, getting him rebated for $80, that would be fine if Trevor Lawrence's target price across the board was $80. I see this more as where teams that have this type of rebate expect yourself to pay $20 on top of what the real
More,
price for
so
Trevor Lawrence is.
it.
Yeah. Simply because as a player bidding against that, I'm going to be well aware that you have a $20 stipend for Trevor Lawrence. And so it's almost like one of those things where for you to get that, you've got to win Trevor Lawrence. So I know you're going to be almost all in on Trevor Lawrence. Not all in, but like you're going to do what you need to do to get Trevor Lawrence. And with that, I'm going to rather you pay, if everybody else is getting Trevor Lawrence for $80,
you're going to make sure
I want to make sure that
so
you're going to pay 100 so you get him for 80. I'm not going to be like, okay, Trevor Lawrence is at 80, you're going to get him for 60 now. This is kind of how I see that playing out. Which again, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that this just gives teams the flexibility to I want to say mess up, but it's not a mess up. It's like to go ahead out there and get your guy. Go ahead and pay. You can pay extra. You can do whatever because you have that there, and you can make sure you lock him up. That's kind of how I see this going, because again, like it's one of those things too. Like if I have, you say a player that's less than $20, I'm trying to think of somebody who would have had like so I'll use one. I loved Elijah Holyfield. I will and go on the record for saying that he was one of my until he ran his 40 speed, he was like, I loved him. And then I was like, shit, well, that's it for him. Elijah Holyfield was a guy that I love. If I put, if I draft him in there and then it comes time, like, so he would have been, at the top of my Devy board, and he was at the almost very top of mine. I think others had him pretty high as well. Where if you take him and you have that $20, and then comes time, Elijah Holyfield, I don't even think he might have been 7th round if he was drafted at all. I would automatically put $20 on, and doing that, I think that pretty much kind of ensures that I get Elijah Holyfield. But at the same time, like if I'm somebody that's bidding against that, just to make sure, you could bid all the way up to $20, just don't go over it. Yeah,
you absolutely could. And that's where I think kind of the second point is, like, good teams can narrow in on players that they could win for free. Kind of the idea, like if there's a guy I want and in the draft he's not going to be one of the top Devy pieces, maybe I throw him as a draft one because he could work out and be really good, and I'm going to get him for $0 because I don't expect him to be more than that. And I think those types of things will ultimately like work themselves out. I don't think either of us, we have ideas on how this could work, but this is a very brand new idea in terms of what the application ends up being, or how people actually utilize it, or do we even find the value that we think we're going to? We're not sure on this. That's why it's a new wrinkle. We're trying it out. We're going to see if it actually provides that value, and we can always try to adjust it. But ultimately, I think when we decided on creating this idea was, one, it still allowed the primary vehicle of acquiring players to be the auction, which I think is something both you and I wanted to be, the primary focus. We wanted the auction to dictate the market and how these players are acquired. One, it lessens the tracking of what we have to do as commissioners when we're looking at players. Like, we don't have to do a draft. We do have to do a draft, but there's no like keeping tabs of players. This is only going to be really looking at players that are juniors and seniors in college,
Right.
college football, because I'm not going to keep tabs of Devies year over year. So you should be picking
We have
players.
that marked somewhere,
Yeah, it's on the
just so that
bylaws.
people don't ask. Because I mean, I know people will be like, "Can I take anybody?" or "What's a
Yeah,
Debbie?"
I know that will
'Cause
happen.
it's
It's going to
coming.
happen even if I have it in the bylaws. I've marked it that if they don't declare for the NFL, they are going to be back in the Devi pool to be drafted the very next year with no one.
100%.
Yep.
Yep. Yep.
It just kind of reduces the tracking of it, reduces the issues. The one thing I have been playing with, and this is something we can talk about as a league later, is this idea of are both copies reserved to that one team? And right now it's that way because it's just so much easier to track and know that Wisconsin Badgers has the right to this one player. And if I see on the transaction page, Wisconsin Badgers, this player, I can get him as rebate really quickly instead of trying to keep track of two teams that might have those players, especially when it comes to that nomination idea of putting them all on the board at the very start of the auction.
Yeah, I think we could play with trying to track that. I mean, ideally, that might be the best way to go about it.
Yeah.
Because then essentially, what do you do with the other copy of Trevor Lawrence? And it gives Wisconsin two cracks at Trevor Lawrence, which
I think kind of is the point. Like if no one ever got the people that they drafted in Devi, what would be really the incentive to have it? So I think this gives them that second crack.
Yeah, I mean, we got to play. I mean, if it's an absurd like everybody shouldn't get like it shouldn't be across the board with 100% Devi retention rate. Yeah. Either. So I think we've got to play with somewhere in the middle and see kind of where we end up with. But I love the idea. It's about as good as you can get from what we wanted to do. Like I love the idea of being able to invest in the Devi player and letting the Devi player come to you. Kind of like if anybody played, the NCAA, when you would go out and have a coaching visit, have this, and the level of interest in the player comes, like to build a module like that. It's not going to work. This is probably the best option to control the Devi. I think what we'll see is probably more rookies be starting out at $20. Like we will probably see a increase in the cost of top tier rookies and then have a big steep drop off is what I would assume. Like whatever, more often than not, in Devi, you don't hit on the entire first round.
Yeah.
What you do hit on is probably 5 guys, maybe, in out of 10 to 12 play. 10 to 12. I don't know how it is. What is it? 12? How many people are in the thing?
It'll be 16 and 20.
Yeah. So 16. So you're probably that's probably right because you're probably doubling up. So there's probably 8 to 10 usable guys would be my guess that actually hit in that Devi part. And so you'll see a tier. I think you'll see what you'll get is those guys will be overpriced essentially. Then you'll see a drop in price for the rest of that players that are in that same tier, but there's gonna be a price drop there, and then you'll see another price drop for where you would get into the guys that are first to second round guys. So there's going to be a massive drop there. So what I actually think you might see is a whole hell of a lot of value in guys that are later. In the guys that you put the Chase Claypools in there. You put I'm trying to think of who else was late. My brain does not want to work anymore tonight. But Chase Claypool's the only guy I can think of outside of Chase Claypool and Christian McCaffrey. Those are the only 2 guys in the entire NFL that I can think of. And I think I said Eric Ebron. So those are the 3 guys. That
Even not said Eric Ebron today. But okay.
Yeah, I did. I think I did when I was talking about tight ends earlier on. I think replay it. Somebody will clip it. But those mid-tier guys, I think that it makes that group more valuable because in theory with this, their prices should be normalized because they're not going to be guys that for the most part, I mean, you will hit somebody like an Elijah Holyfield, but a better scenario for the player, like where he doesn't go undrafted or 7th round, where he might go instead of being a first round, he's going to be in that 3rd to 5th round and still have some value. Like outside of those guys, those middle tier guys are going to have a whole hell of a lot of value, I think is kind of how this is going to work out.
Yeah. That's a great. I want to add to that point about like Elijah Holyfield. Let's say you grabbed him as a Devy player. This system at least allows you to walk away without having to grab him. Make that cut or anything. You still have the opportunity to not even ever acquire Elijah Holyfield if someone else bids him up from something like. Those are some things that have value in this format too. There's a little bit of flexibility, especially, and we'll talk about vacant teams and changing teams and how this responds. But even new people that fill in for vacancies in the future, they have the option to like walk away from a Devy option. They don't have to pick those players or spend money on them in the auction, even though that they might have been selected in the previous year. So. I appreciate you doing this. We still have, I think, about 3 more things to talk about. The main one being scheduling, which I think we'll spend probably the majority of our time tomorrow, hopefully discussing, but it should be a lot faster. The auction and stuff was very dense material, and it takes some time to work through, but we'll hop back on, do the rest of this hopefully tomorrow. And then we will get that second part out. We'll be going over scheduling, player awards, early declares, and then switching teams, making sure people understand that whole dynamic. So, Lou, thanks.
And I'll touch base too on whatever the auction with the proxy, the notifications. If it, I'll run a test here and see if it notifies if I change my proxy or not. So we'll touch base on that too, because I think that's important. Like if it does notify, then I think everybody should be aware of that. And if it doesn't, then I
would like to be aware of that.
So I think that we'll double check on that and yeah, so I think that's good. I'm excited. I hope everybody else is excited. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. There are so many aspects to a league like this. Like I could sit here. I try to be quiet today and not talk as much, but I could sit here and talk about this type of strategy and this kind of stuff all day long. And I know Brian can too, which is why when we get together, we talk. He does the numbers. I just talk strategy and thoughts and opinions more so than anything. So I'm sure it's backed up by numbers somewhere.
Yeah, that's how you operate in life.
So if there's anything that anybody wants more in depth on, just ask them. I mean, I'm willing to share stuff. I know Brian is, because more often than not, I go, oh shit, dude, I completely didn't, like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, what are your thoughts on, I didn't have time to prepare. I didn't do this. Or what are your thoughts on a price point for this guy or this type of stuff? So don't hesitate to ask. I'm not saying I'm always going to be right, and I don't think Brian's ever right, but more than happy to give.
Wait a second.
Your track record is not.
What are you talking about? I'm the one who has at least one national championship in this
You
format.
took over somebody else's team.
No, I did not. I had to do a dumbass dispersal, and I made that team what it was. I listened to you for 1 year, and I took Jared Goff for a boatload of dumbass money and screwed my team up. And after you left and I didn't have to listen to your opinion in that format, I made myself a contender. What can I say?
I guess we did all right. I don't know if I said Jared Goff. Maybe I did. I think I like Jared Goff paired with something else you had. It doesn't matter. But yeah, so either one of us would be willing, if you have any questions on any of this stuff. We probably honestly just hit the tip of the iceberg on a lot of this, even though there was a lot of information there. There is so many different strategy. Like I hold my tongue on some of this stuff too, because I don't want to throw out every strategy known to mankind, so that somebody, if there's something that we doesn't click or whatever.
We could have talked for hours probably on just auctions.
Because there's so many auction strategies and nominations. Like anybody that's in whatever division Brian's in and wants to know how Brian operates, I'm more than happy to share that information. He's extremely patient. He's going to hold on to his nominations and watch the board. So you're never going to have a full nomination board. Just all that stuff. So I'm more than happy to kind of discuss any of this. The only thing there's a couple new things that I think we hit on what was new that we're testing out and playing with. don't have experience on it, but probably have some thoughts and opinions on how it ideally would work, or how you should ideally go about navigating it. And then honestly, the biggest change is probably the money. I mean, we're playing with $400 here, which is a little bit different. I don't have the track record of going, okay, this is what a player like this goes like. Brian's done the math, so he's probably one to ask for that. But
Even that said,
other than that,
I'm kind of shooting in the dark when it comes to those things, and startups are very different. Like once we get a few seasons under our belt, like the price points for rookies and position players become much better defined in a format like this. Like, when you're overspending on a player, like I should never pay $80 for this player. But startups a little hard to, because we're never gonna do it this way again. Like this is it.
right,
We'll have
right.
nothing to ever build on. So
Right. And don't mess it up, because if you mess it up, it'll take you a long time to fix it. But yeah, so I mean, the topics tomorrow, I'm really looking forward to. Scheduling is amazing. The player awards is newish. I mean, we have it in NFLU, but I think we took it a step in a different direction here. And then switching the teams, I mean, it is what it is. But the big bulk of it tomorrow is going to be scheduling, which if you do watch these, you should definitely pay attention to scheduling, because it's extremely important in a league like this. It can honestly make or break your season if your team is good and you're attempting to win a national championship. So it'll be all good stuff tomorrow regarding scheduling and player rewards and stuff like that. So
all right, so we'll talk with everyone again hopefully tomorrow. So have a good one.